Welcome to Optimal Health Online. This should be an adventure for both of us. I'm hopeful that you will be gracious with my attempts at trying to put together some slides and doing voiceover narration, and that we can still learn a lot about optimal health. I am kind of excited because this is somewhat where I wanted to be anyway in the course, and that is that we were going to move to watching some documentaries that I thought were valuable and then discussing them together online in a discussion board on Canvas. Today what we're going to do is going to count for the whole week's lecture, and I just want to get us started with some of the terms and some of the basics of what we're going to need to understand as our foundation for understanding all the diets out there. And so just some general concepts. We can start with this poor guy, a student who became obsessed with healthy diet that cut out protein and carbohydrates, killed himself after his health dramatically declined. 22-year-old, formerly a pescatarian, that's somebody that eats fish, but became fixated with vegetables and fruit-only recipes. He was a food technology student in Stockport. That's a big city in England. He became convinced he had issues with his bones and started to lose his hair. His mental state then began to deteriorate amid fears he was struggling with his university degrees. His mother, who was a nurse, told his inquest she tried to tell him he was losing his dreadlocks because of his diet, but he was adamant the diet he was following was correct. And here he was, here's a kid who was so concerned he wanted to do all the right things that he just didn't use common sense, and he ended up dying. So as we look at popular diets, it might be a good place to start in asking doctors what they think. And some people berate doctors for not knowing enough about preventive medicine and those kinds of things, but I think that's not necessarily the case as much as it was years ago. But anyway, they were asked which diets they would follow and which ones they would recommend for their. And it came out that most of them followed the Mediterranean diet or recommended it. And that's not surprising at all because it's the traditional one. It has the good healthy oils, it has a lot of vegetables and some fruit and then fish. And so that's what we hear pretty much in those. The other group would be interesting to know what other was because that's a pretty good group. I was kind of surprised that intermittent fasting was up this high, because it's relatively new and I don't think it's as well known. The DASH diet is definitely a medical diet. That's how it was started, and it was to prevent high blood pressure or hypertension, and so low sodium and some other things like that. Keto, lacto, all these paleo, you can see all these up there that they're not really as popular or as widespread. You hear a lot about them, but as far as what doctors would recommend, not too many of them would. Let me put down whole 30 there. I'm surprised 3% even hit that. Here are 5 diets that we're going to hear a lot about, and keto is up there, Mediterranean. Carb cycling has to do with when you can have carbs and you have days without carbs. Intermittent fasting, just going a long time without any food and then hopefully have fat burning going on there. And tracking your macros has to do with just following how much and what percentages you're eating of carbs, fats, and proteins. I thought this was a good slide that shows not only what kind of foods they are, they're trying to show you the percentage of fats, proteins, carbs, dairy, and grains. And we'll at least mention all of them. We might not go into all of the depth of them, but you can see here, for instance, keto, there's a lot of protein here. These are basically fats. Different ways to get fat. Some of them are good. Saturated fat in the butter might not be as acceptable to some people, others not. Here the zone basically is low carb and higher fats and protein if you look at 2/3 of the plate there. South Beach diet has a lot going for it in that they want healthy oils as they cut back on carbs. And again, we looked at the DASH diet. Over here, the Whole30 diet is pretty interesting. Let me tell you just a minute about that. So this Whole30, basically you remove inflammatory foods and beverages in your diet. And so you take out added sugar, sweeteners, alcohol, grains, legumes, dairy, processed foods and beverages, baked goods, and junk food. So that sounds like you're going to eat very clean. And so at the start, you think, oh, this sounds like a pretty good deal. But it should be noted the U.S. News and World Report released its annual rankings of diets, and Whole30 ranked dead last. Why? Because they found it so restrictive and high in sodium. And so some of these things that they're not going to let you have a wide variety of food, that means you're probably not getting a wide variety of nutrients, or at least that's something you need to check into. Then as we finish up these other plates, the alkaline diet based on the pH of your body, I think that's kind of interesting. It's similar to one called a diet for your blood group. And I think that that's kind of interesting. As an aside, if somebody wanted to do this for their critique later, the flu going around now, they say that certain people's blood type can affect how the symptoms are with you. And I think that O right now is the most protected. And I thought that was pretty interesting. But then as we look at the rest of these, Atkins is the one that seriously I really, 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 really get upset about, in that I think he did a lot of damage. And other people have learned from it, but it's one of the worst diets out there. So here's a whole chart that if you wanted to pause here and look at all of them, I think it's definitely able to see everything. And we're going to try to go through this, but I just think this would be so boring just to run through it. So I'm going to try to find other ways for us to find out all this information, but in smaller little pieces. So basically, I'm trying to head us toward the talk about vegan and vegetarianism. And it does show that there's a lot of healthy people out there using those. But are these people healthy because they eat so many plants and vegetables, or because they avoid meat or other animals? And maybe you could do both. And so those are kinds of questions that I have. I don't eat a lot of I don't eat hardly any red meat, but chicken and some fish and things like that. But still, you wonder, and so this is worth looking into, and I wanted to look into this. But when they throw around the words vegan, vegetarian, and plant-based, what do they really mean by those? And we need to be sensitive to really listening carefully so we understand. So here, we want to go back, and I know we've reviewed some of this, on where we came from. What is the background of this? And the background is that our U.S. government has tried to give us guidelines on how to eat. And they've done it a million different ways, but the most popular, and in your lifetime, you've probably heard of the pyramid, or my pyramid, or the good eating pyramid, or whatever it is. And now we're at my plate. But Willett read this and sees these things, and he says, wait, this isn't what the research says. So we just want to look and say, these others were too oversimplified. And what Willett has done is said, no, we need to break this down. You can't just clump all carbohydrates together. You can't just clump fats together. And it's not that hard. It's pretty easy, actually. We also want to look at the idea of popular diets and keto, paleo. All of those will be involved there. And then today, if nothing else, we get your understand the glycemic index and the glycemic load, then you're ready to move on. And what that is going to do is, this glycemic obviously means sugar in the blood. And what we're talking about is how fast does it go in, and because of the speed at which it goes, it triggers an insulin response. And that's going to influence how you store fat. Intermittent fasting is, again, the idea of if you keep carbs out of the blood, you keep insulin out of the blood, and so you don't store fat, and you're going to go on and burn fat as an energy source. So we're manipulating hormones. This is really, hormones get so tricky, but these are some of the ways they're trying to manipulate this. And then artificial sweeteners, today's lecture won't have a lot on that, but people think, oh, I'm not having carbs if I'm not having these artificial sweeteners, or if I'm not having sugar. And these artificial sweeteners can do terrible things to your gut bacteria. And we want to avoid those. And I'll have more later, but it's not going to be so much in today's lecture. Okay, so we've seen this pyramid. I have all the groups up here, and the whole thing we want to learn is they're generalizing by this foundational, and they're generalizing with fats, and I'll break that out in a second. So here is Willett's, and we're going to compare the two, and you can see he has more segments, and they're divided differently. So he has exercise and weight control. It's not mentioned in the other. That's fine. But then as we start looking at carbohydrates, here he differentiates between foods that have a high glycemic impact. We're not saying the glycemic index here because he's kind of anti that. He's into a thing called glycemic load, which we'll teach you about here in a minute. But he has whole grains. Here they're just putting all the starches together. So it's quite different in that respect. So he has half of them here and half of them way at the top of the pyramid where you're not, rarely or sparingly, where they're all lumped together here. So that's probably the biggest difference. And then, so here you can see there's pretty similar vegetables in abundance, 3 to 5 servings, and it's of fruits and vegetables. They want a lot of plants. Okay, everyone agrees plants are good for you. Then how do we get our calcium? And where Willett says you can have dairy or you can supplement, you read in your book that he criticized pretty heavily the impact the American dairy producers have on these kinds of things. And so dairy is prominent in all of these, and it's an economic reason, not necessarily a nutritious one. And then as we look at this, fish, poultry, eggs, 0 to 2 times. He doesn't care if you have it, as long as you get some protein somewhere. Where over here, they're saying 2 to 3 servings of meat, poultry, fish, dried beans. So they want you to get your protein here. Where Willett adds this and says, look, red meat. Now, it's not so much the protein in the meat, it's the package. And he's pretty good at saying that. He says, when you have animal fat or animal protein, it usually comes with animal fat, which is saturated fat. And so he's worried about that because we know people that have high saturated fat in their diets have a higher risk of heart disease. And then as we look at nuts and legumes, now we know there's tons of calories in these, and we're not talking about a lot of them, but to have these every day. And this goes with the idea of not only are you getting the protein and the fiber, you're getting the oil. And he's going to be really big on oils. So here we see he wants plant oils at most meals, not just daily, at most meals. So this is very much like the Mediterranean diet with the olive oil, where instead of putting butter on the bread, they'll have olive oil maybe on their plate. They'll use the bread to wipe it up. And so they have a lot of oil. As an aside, if you're into strength and conditioning, that kind of a thing, it's huge that everybody that wants to gain muscle, they talk about making sure you have enough fats. If you don't have fats, you're not going to make muscle. And there's also part of that is testosterone levels. And you want the good, healthy ones. Avocados, olive oil, nuts, fish. All of those are great. And as you see, Willett really emphasize those at most meals, not even every day. Where here they're all lumped together, all kinds of fats is to use sparingly. Again, this is just emphasizing the idea of the package that the protein came in, and the saturated fat is associated with animal products. Now as we look at Willett's plate, which is very similar to the US My Plate, half the plate is fruits and vegetables. Get your carbs over here and whole grains. He also has a healthy protein, but here he's saying water is fine. He wants to limit milk. to 1 to 2 servings a day, and a small glass of juice. So don't drink your calories, don't get sugar water and that kind of stuff. He's anti-milk. I'm not as anti-milk because I was raised on a dairy and it works well for my family. We know a lot of people are lactose intolerant and it wouldn't work well for them. And then over here, he wants to have a lot of oil but limit butter and avoid trans fats. And as we've mentioned before, this is dairy, but fruits and vegetables, carbs, protein. Now, as we transition here to examples, and we've been talking a little bit about macros, there's no magic combination of fat versus carb versus protein, Dr. Alice Lichtenstein said. The bottom line is calories, calories, calories. As an illustration of this, Dr. Hobb, who is a professor of nutrition at Kansas State, he decided to use himself as a guinea pig and to try this. So what he did the Twinkie diet. And in this diet, he ate excuse me, convenience store foods every day for 10 weeks. So what would happen to him? Well, it ends up he ate these things throughout the day. And so these are sugary little cakelets, as it says there. And so he would have some variety with Hostess, Little Debbie's, Doritos, sugary cereals, and Oreos too. His premise was it doesn't matter how much are carbs, proteins, fats. It was just pure calorie counting that mattered, not the nutritional value of the food. And on this, he lost 27 pounds in 2 months. He limited himself to 1,800 calories a day, so that's lower calorie. A man of his he was eating around 2,600 calories. He followed the basic principle of weight loss, consumed significantly fewer calories than he burned. His body mass went from 28.8 down to 24.9, which is normal. He now weighs 174 pounds. You might expect other indicators of his health would have suffered, but that's not what happened. So what they found was his bad cholesterol, his LDL, low density lipoprotein, dropped 20%, and his good cholesterol increased 20%. That's what you want to have happen. He reduced the level of triglycerides, the fats floating in your blood, and that went down by 39%. So this is where it gets confusing. What does that mean? Does that mean I'm healthier, he asked, or does it mean how we define health from a biology standpoint? What are we missing? So first off, Willett, all the way through his book, says over and over again, the most important thing you can do for good health is maintain a healthy weight throughout your lifetime. So this guy, by just losing weight, these other things increased. That goes on to reinforce this idea of that your fat on your body doesn't just sit there and is inert doing nothing. It secretes hormones. It makes the rest of your body do things that maybe you don't want it to do. So this probably, you could estimate, would help his risk of heart disease. It would lower it because his cholesterol went down, etc. But what about cancer risk? So our major two things that we think about with dying, there's a lot of ways to die, but these are our biggest killers, right? Heart disease, number one, and then cancer. What is it going to do about his risk of cancer? And what we know right now is that diets full of vegetables help prevent cancer, and he's not eating any. So while he may reduce his cardiovascular risk, he's probably increased his risk of other cancers. So now as I try to classify different ones, the broad strokes here are that some are low fat, some are very low fat, in fact. And so Dr. Dean Ornish is very low fat. The fat that he does have, it's all olive oil, but not very much of it. Then we have the traditional ones, and this is the American Heart Association, this is our government, this is Weight Watchers. And then Willett, and you see I'm scooting him over a little bit on the edge of the column because he doesn't necessarily say we need to limit our fat to less than 30% of the calories in our diet. He doesn't really care how much as long as it's from plants. We have another category here where they just want you to eat less calories. And this is also a very big topic in that we basically overeat. And here what they're trying to say is eat foods that make you full but don't have calories. So popcorn and things like that. Then we get to this next section, and this is where we start into low carbohydrate, which means what are you going to eat? It's going to be protein and fat in different amounts. And so you've probably heard of the zone diet. And so that's 40, 30, 30. And the idea is 40% carbs, 30% fat, 30% protein. And that's radically different than the 10% fat in the American Heart Association's diet. And then if we go even further than that, the South Beach diet is someone using their head when looking at the Atkins diet, where Atkins is horrible in the kind of fat, in the saturated fat that he talks about here. And so what the South Beach diet does is say, well, we're not going to take these saturated fats. We're going to use olive oil, avocados, good healthy ones like that. But it's still going to be lower in carbs because they want to avoid insulin, and that's where this whole lecture is moving to. And so instead of eating that, we're going to then have more fat in our diet, more protein in our diet, but minimize the carbs. So you can see I labeled the tops here just so that you can start to get a sense of how much different they can be. And so here, really a lot of the difference is in how much protein. And you can see one is very high protein and the other is moderate. And again, depending on what your goals are, if you're an athlete that's turning over muscle all the time and breaking it down and building it up, then you'd probably want to be higher protein anyway. So when we look at this, when we say high protein, we also mean low carb. And so there's a lot of different ways to do this and put this together, and we'll look at some of these. But research has shown that a high protein diet in conjunction with low carbs can increase or create a metabolic environment called acidosis. Okay, well, now we're starting to get to where we can talk about other diets. Because really, when they talk about acidosis, they're talking about ketoacidosis, which is where the keto diet comes from. There's a dangerous condition for some diabetics where they can get into ketoacidosis, and it's not something they want to do to lose weight. But basically what it is they don't handle carbohydrates, which is what diabetes is all about. And so what happens is they're burning fat and they build up these harmful keto acids, and it can be dangerous for them. Well, what they've learned from that is that it will burn fat eventually, but it's not an efficient way to burn fat either. And so that's what this whole thing is about. So for instance, because we're taking this little time out into ketosis, let's talk a minute about some of the side effects. And you can see that it would rarely be used with an athlete, because if you don't have carbs, you're going to be fatigued. You need these for energy. Now, other people will say that you can eventually get used to this, and that's what some of these videos are about and such like that. But here, this bad breath, this has to do with rotten apple breath, this kind of a thing. But what they'll talk about is that it can be temporary. It goes away when you become keto adapted. That's because your body had become efficient at using all the ketones it is making, and only a small amount gets expelled through your breath. And so will this change your body from burning carbs into burning fat? And the idea is that some people think they can. One of the major criticisms is this is really hard to do the rest of your life. Other people think your body's not designed for this, and you'll have to make up your own decisions. So now I'm probably going to take too long to hammer home this point of the low carbs and how your body's going to work with this, but this really is the most important point of the lecture. So if you don't have carbs and you're on a very low carb diet, that can work periodically. But you have to understand how they work so that you don't lose muscle tissue. You know that most of our first half I went over and over and over about metabolism, and you're going to raise your metabolism by having muscle, and if you don't have it, then you're going to slow your metabolism. So in the end, periodically lowering carbohydrate intake can work to reduce body fat, because if you don't have carbs, they're trying to get you to burn body fat. And it can be extreme and you can have problems, but we know that it can work. But they're suggesting doing it for short periods of time. In this case, what they're saying is, if you're on very low carbs, where are you going to get energy? And we don't want it to go from muscle. So when you deprive your body of glucose, which is where we get this from the carbs, it's necessary for your body to use alternate energy sources. Stored body fat is what you're trying to get to. But if it also can get to your skeletal muscle. And so then there's this little saying, fat burns in a carbohydrate flame. And so you have to have a little bit. And so people sometimes disagree on how much and those kinds of things. But just fasting or it's not the most efficient way. So that brings us back to what we talked about this, how carbohydrates are carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but so is protein if you add a nitrogen. So you can see that if your body is only going to run off carbohydrates here, we have to break this down, and we can do that with protein. But then we get rid of the nitrogen. It's going to go out in your urine, and they can measure how much protein you're breaking down by how much nitrogen is in your urine. Here, this graphic is what this is all about. And the idea that if you have high insulin, usually it's because you're having high carb diets, you're eating frequently so that your body is always processing this, the opposite of the intermittent fasting as you see over here, and then sedentary living. And so all of these things lower insulin. By not eating refined carbs particularly, by giving your body rest in between so that it's not has insulin out there all the time, and by especially high intensity exercise. So when carbohydrates decrease, so does insulin. And this insulin, as we have that, the more we have, that can inhibit fat oxidation. Fat oxidation means we're burning it. And so we don't want to have insulin out there because that's going to limit how much fat we can burn. On the other hand, high insulin levels can increase the activity of other enzymes that promote body fat accumulation. So insulin is associated with storing fat. So a little timeout here, and that is that insulin secretion seems to be highest during sleep, making more sense out of the notion that carbs at bedtime are counterproductive to fat loss. Well, that's kind of been re-looked at. And for sure, you don't want to have a Coke before bed, or even, your Rice Krispie cookies. So those refined carbs are going to give a spike of glucose, get that blood sugar up, insulin's going to go, probably make it easier. But as far as carbs at night, they can also be replenished. Like if you had a hard workout during the day, it also allows that to be replenished. So good carbs at night are not a problem. If you want a bowl of oatmeal or something like that, then that's good for it. The whole thing here, and I know we're going over and over and over this, but all of these diets are predicated on the idea that they're going to control insulin, that is so important. If you control insulin, you'll control how much fat is being stored on your body. Conversely, when you deprive your body of glucose, it becomes necessary for your body to find this alternate energy source. And we want it to be the stored body fat and not the protein of your muscles. And so how do we do this? How can we make sure this is happening? So this is another little timeout comment thing. And on the two big ones here, keto and intermittent fasting. So let's first do the keto. You're trying to get into a state where your body doesn't have carbohydrates and it's going to start burning fat. And it's inefficient and those kinds of things. But if you give it enough carbohydrates, even though it's way less than you used to, you may or may not be in ketosis. So they want you to get as low as you can on the carbs, and that way you'll be in keto. Now, the intermittent fasting is similar, and that is that this isn't supposed to be something that you can't live with. And in fact, probably a lot of you do this already. So let's say you go to bed, you get at least 8 hours of sleep, and now let's say you get up, just help me do the math here, and you get up at 7. And so then you're going to not eat until 11. So now that's been a long fast on your body. So a lot of college students do that. But what if you decide, I'm going to knock the edge off, and so I'm going to grab that Pop-Tart on the way to my 725 Optimal Health class. And so you eat this refined sugar. that kills all this, well, not all necessarily, but it kills this idea of that your body is doing without carbohydrate, so it's going to go do the fat, and that's why this intermittent fast is supposed to do. It's supposed to lower insulin, lower carbohydrates, so this happens. It's fine to have water. It's fine to have non-caloric anything. And you can have coffee and tea because there's no calories in that. And so now your body will still have to figure out ways. But the worst thing you can do as far as sabotaging the work that you're doing is to sneak little sugar packets in along the way, because now that's enough to get insulin going, and it's really not making you feel satiated and happy about your uh, energy level. So now we transition back to high protein carbohydrate diets. This is muscle biopsies, and what they did is they put these people on different diets. And so here they were on a high protein, low carb diet. And so this can be, I have several of these studies where they exercise them day after day after day. And if you don't get to replenish your carbs, well, then your muscle glycogen store is going to go less and less and less. But people that are on a normal mixed diet, they get the carbs back in their muscles. The next day, they're ready to exercise. Some of these are exercise to exhaustion. And you can imagine how if you don't have carbs, you're going to be exhausted a lot sooner than this person who every day is putting back in the carbs. So it would be really unusual for an athlete to want to be on a low carbohydrate diet, a mixed diet, or high carb diet for long distance running, because this is the primary energy source you're designed to use. If you're trying to lose weight in the off season or something like that, that's a different story. So Atkins and all his ilk really justify all of this kind of stuff because of this next section, and that is the glycemic index. What do foods do to your blood sugar after you ingest them? So what they do is they take people and they have them fast. And so then after this fast, they give them 50 grams of carbohydrate, and then they draw their blood over the next couple hours, and they see how high the blood glucose went up because of the food they ate on an empty stomach. This was based on either a slice of white bread or pure glucose. So most of us will adjust to changes in blood glucose level. But some of us are more susceptible to extremes, and so they may benefit from having low glycemic foods and sustaining it throughout the day. So smaller meals throughout the day, as long as they're not high sugar ones. And that can work for some people. And you spread out glucose absorption that way, which is kind of the opposite of this intermittent fasting idea. So I've chosen these examples as teaching points. So what I'm asking you here is, what do you think would cause a higher rise and a faster rise in your blood sugar? Ice cream or potatoes? And it ends up, ice cream produces less of a response than potatoes. That's why everybody put potatoes up at the top of their pyramid now. They want to limit these. Now, sweet potatoes aren't quite the same as regular white potatoes. But the reason is, and this is why it's a teaching point for us here, is that ice cream has both fat and it has protein. Now, it has sugar, obviously, too. But the fat in it slows down how fast it's dumped into the bloodstream. Okay, now what about baked potato or a mashed potato? Well, it ends up, it depends on how long you bake it. The longer you bake starches, the more sugary they get, and the sweeter they get. But basically, a mashed potato is a more digested food, and so it's going to cause a greater rise in your blood sugar than a baked potato is. And then as we looked at these dried beans or legumes, what's that going to do? Well, they're high in fiber and probably high in protein, and so it's going to have a slow rise in blood sugar, and so it keeps blood levels low. What about a sweet juicy apple? So this is our big trickster one in here, because I use the adjective sweet there, and so you would think it's going to cause a rise, but it doesn't, and the reason is because of fructose or fructose, depending on who you listen to. It's processed differently than glucose and sucrose, table sugar, and it isn't necessarily good for us. What we want to know here is that protein, fat, and fiber all slow down gastric emptying and help you avoid an insulin spike. Okay, that's what we need to do. The other thing is that all these stories were just on an empty stomach with only this carbohydrate. But we eat in mixed meals, and so that it's going to change that way. So this is the glycemic index, and as I tried to say on another slide ago, that usually they don't have just a number. It's a reference. It's comes back to what it was for you. So the first time you go in after fasting, they give you either 50 grams of white bread or of glucose. And then they see what that does to your body. And now that is set at 100. Whatever reading that was, how much sugar is in your blood at that time, that they're just going to call that 100. Now you come in all these other times and they're going to compare it to that. So you're 2 points higher, you're 2 points lower. They're going from that reference food of either a piece of white bread or glucose. So we can see here, and I'm surprised. Now waffles I'm not too surprised with, but a donut, because of the fat in it, I'm a little surprised there. Now, when I go through this, we're not really trying to learn this because, as far as memorization, because we don't believe in this, and that'll be clear in a minute. But first, I need to set this up so you understand where the fallacy is in this glycemic index. So here, I've already told you protein and fiber slow things down, so you're not surprised that rice bran or all bran are low glycemic foods. Get a lot of fiber, it's going to be slow. But what about shredded wheat? It's 100% wheat. Is it processed so much that it's quick? What about cream of wheat? It is more processed than some of the others. But you see here, oatmeal. How can oatmeal be this? And here, there are different kinds. We're not really talking about what you probably do in your dorm where you have that instant oatmeal that's full of brown sugar and all that kind of stuff. We're talking about real oats that are cooked. It takes a little bit longer, either in a microwave or a stovetop. It's going to slow things down. A lot of fiber in there. Cornflakes, not too surprising that it's up really high, 119. Oatmeal cookie could be deceiving because of whether it's fiber, whether there's fat in it, those kinds of things. And then you can see dairy products are generally very low. So yes, they have lactose, which is a sugar, but it's low, and they have high protein, and depending on whether it's full fat or not, it's going to slow things down there too. As we continue to look at this, here's white bread, a bagel that sounds healthy and all that kind of stuff, but what it does to your body is it quickly raises your blood sugar. The French baguette, I assume it's because it's more refined, etc. Watermelon, it's a sweet fruit, and so it's a lot of sugar in it, and so it's going to have a high glycemic index. Now, as we look at some of these here, they generalize high glycemic foods, so you can see glucose and sucrose. All these things, sugars, right? And then right next to it is the bagel, the white bread, a potato, cornflakes, raisins because of the high sugar. But we're going to come back, and we're not saying this is going to be accurate. We're going to come back and explain why there's some faults to this, especially when we get to these kinds of foods that we consider to be good foods. But moderate foods, whole grain breads, depends on the pasta, what it's made out of, but corn, oatmeal, all these. And now look at this, low glycemic foods. So fructose, yogurt, we got the dairy in there again, and then peanuts. They got the oil, they got the protein, they got the fiber. But let's take a time out here for fructose. Fructose is not probably your friend. In small amounts, it's not a big deal. And one of the big differences between Powerade and Gatorade is that Powerade uses fructose. Everybody would like to use it, but if you put in too much, you get gastric distress. And so they can't put in too much. But it's a low glycemic ingredient. But it also is metabolized differently in your body. And so what happens is it goes to the liver, and it ends up raising your levels of the very low density lipoproteins. So this is not good. And so we don't want to have too much. So excess fructose. You want to avoid this. So now we come to and how we're going to tie this all up and put the ribbon on it. And that is, we're not surprised here by baked potato. See, it's even higher than white bread, and instant potatoes. I would kind of think they're switched, but it depends on how much you cook these. So that's not too surprising. That's kind of the way this scenario has been going. But look at this, carrots at 101. So Atkins, he says, never eat carrots. Carrots are horrible. They're too sweet. You should never have carrots. Well, that's kind of ridiculous, and a lot of people know that. So this is the one that's going to help us understand why we don't use the glycemic index as a Bible. That we don't just take it and not understand what's going on here. A couple more here that are just interesting. Again, snack foods, you see peanuts so low, and then pretzels. Pretzels aren't necessarily a good snack. They're going to be treated, it's white refined and salt. It's not a good snack. Here's some more you can look at. Rice Krispies, you see they're pretty high, right up there with pretzels. So now we get back to the carrots, and some people were concerned about baby carrots and that kind of stuff. There's no such thing as a baby carrot that we see. Those are just carrots that are run through a machine that was the size of green beans. The first guy that did that, he just cut up his ugly carrots, rounded them off with his bean thing, and was able to sell ones that they didn't like because they weren't cosmetically pleasing. So that's a different thing. But here's the gist of it. We all know that anything in excess can be unhealthy, and there are those who express concern about carrots' high sugar content. And so this is Atkins saying you shouldn't eat carrots. So here, myth one: carrots get a bad rap because they're high in sugar. But even though that's technically true, it's a bit misleading. Though carrots do have a high sugar content, that's more important is that they're very low in calories and you don't raise your blood sugar very much, at least not in the proportions commonly consumed. The glycemic load is to measure the impact a food has on blood sugar based on the amount of carbohydrate per serving, and in conjunction with other fats and proteins in the same meal. This differs from the glycemic index, which measures the food's impact based on 50 grams of carbohydrates. So let me show you how this works here. So carrots on the glycemic load have a 3 out of 20. And there it ranks 20 and above as high, and 10 or below is low. And it has a 3, okay? So it would take 8 of the baby carrots to equal about 8 grams of carbohydrates. So here's how we tie this all together. The index. This makes sense in science to have something standard. And what they did, they standardized how much carbs each individual is going to get. They're going to get 50 grams of carb. Doesn't matter the quantity, what it takes to get up to 50 grams. They're getting 50 grams of carbs. But for carrots, it would take 50 baby carrots to get 50 grams of carbohydrates. Well, who's going to sit down and do that? So what Willett and others came up with was this glycemic load. It's based on serving size, not on 50 grams. So nobody's going to sit down and eat, 19 carrots. And so here, this makes sense on what it's going to do to a typical person in a typical serving. So what this shows us is that with the glycemic load, approximately 2 Twinkies are about the same as 9 cups of cut up carrots, or 18 medium-sized carrots, or 50 of the little baby carrots, is equal to 2 Twinkies in the amount of carbohydrates they have. But we don't sit down and eat this many carrots. Okay, so now you understand the difference between glycemic index and glycemic load. A load is off serving size, index is off of 50 grams. And so for a lot of those foods we're looking at, like how much shredded wheat you have to eat to get 50 grams of carbohydrate out of that. All right, now what we're going to look at is that yes, we need to be aware of what foods raise our blood sugar levels and how fast it does. But even there, this is not set in stone. So play this game with me. Which is going to raise your blood sugar quicker, a banana or a cookie? It ends up that for this person, a banana raised their blood sugar higher than the cookie. Now, yes, you would want to know how much of the cookie, is it a sugar cookie? Is it an oat cookie? All that could matter, but that's not the gist of this. This is that whatever cookie, whatever banana they use, this is participant 445. Let's look at participant 644. They got the opposite. So what these two participants did, This guy got a spike of blood sugar by eating a cookie, and this guy got the blood sugar spike from eating a banana. So what we're saying is it can be individual differences. And so you can't just look at an index and then say no one should ever eat a banana or nobody should ever eat a cookie. We have individual differences. So this tries to explain that. And I think it's important to say that this doesn't mean we should throw out the glycemic index, because for 10 of the 12 people in this particular algorithm, um, it was correctly predicted responses to the good and bad diets and what happened to them. The foods on the good diet for one person were sometimes on another person's bad list. Okay, so we can work on this, and we can see what they do to you. If you wanted to do glucose monitoring, we even have machines that we can do that. Now we get to the next big chunk of this. And this is, how do we regulate blood glucose ranges, and why is this such a big deal? It's hormonally controlled. And so that's what all these diets are based on. It's whether you have insulin or glucagon, they're key factors in controlling your blood glucose levels. There are other hormones that also do this. And so when we look at that, we see epinephrine, norepinephrine. So these are adrenaline. And then we have cortisol, which is stress hormone, and we have growth hormones. All of these regulate that. But the ones that are, the diets are really trying to look at or target is insulin. But I need you to remember these other hormones. When do they come into play? When we exercise or we're under stress. So we can say this is a good diet for you. But if you're about to go exercise for 2 hours of HIIT, you're going to go after it really high intensity, you can get away with having some sugar in your diet. If you're ever going to have a sugary snack, have it right before you go play, because what's going to happen is epinephrine's going to come out then, or adrenaline, and it will tell your body, don't secrete insulin right now because I want this sugar. And so those things we need to keep in mind. This is about normal everyday life. It's not about exercise physiology right now. I'm going to try to illustrate this, and I'm not sure I'm going to do a good job about this, but in general, when your blood glucose level goes up, there's little chemoreceptors throughout your body, and they're going to send signals out that say, hey, this is too much sugar, I'm going to go into a coma, please release insulin and get this out of the blood. And so they're going to be transported to cells, and they're going to try to cram the sugar into cells if it can. And so if your muscles, if you just exercised, you've burned up all that glycogen, then they're going to stuff it in there. Or you can store some more in your liver, you can store some in your blood. But after that, what if you haven't exercised and you just had a Coke on an empty stomach, and you just got this huge assault of glucose into your blood? Well, then insulin's job is to take that and get rid of it before you go into a coma. The opposite is also true. When you go very low in blood glucose, then your pancreas releases glucagon, and that breaks down stored glycogen into glucose and brings your blood sugar level up. So don't make fun of my illustrations here. I know they're not perfect. This is supposed to be a normal capillary bed, and we're trying to keep our blood glucose between these two numbers, 115 and 70 milligrams per deciliter. And so as long as we're staying between there, we feel good, we have enough energy, we're not fatigued, we're not overly excited, all of this kind of stuff. We're happy campers. Then, I don't know why my graph jumps outside the capillary bed, it just does. That's to show elevated range of blood glucose. When that happens, that's not good, and your body cannot live with this. So the chemoreceptors are going to sense this, and they're going to say, pancreas, please release some insulin, get this blood back down into normal limits. And so it will take glucose, it'll transport it to cells, and it will convert it to glycogen in a stored form if it can. And so now your blood sugar went down. But it doesn't know exactly how much you had, or if there's more coming, if you're going to continue shoveling more sugar in there. So usually your blood sugar will go down below where it was before. And so now this is why you have sugar high, and then you feel the crash afterwards with fatigue, because now you have low blood sugar levels. But then your pancreas and the chemoreceptors that are measuring it say it's too low. Pancreas, please release glucagon, which will break down glycogen into glucose and increase the synthesis of glucose, and now trying to get back there. And this is that yo-yo idea of blood glucose that we want to try to avoid. So if this is supposed to be a capillary bed around a muscle fiber that we used earlier, that glucose is transported to this by insulin, and it says, hey, I'm knocking on the door, glucose, I want you to go in here and be stored as glycogen. Well, that's fine if you just exercised, and you can even store some of this because you just burned this up and you need some more. But what if glycogen stores are full? You haven't exercised and it's all full. Then it's got to store it as fat. And that's the big deal with insulin. Cannot store it anywhere, but it's got to get it out of the bloodstream, so it will store those calories as fat. And if you just keep doing this over and over, you just keep getting fatter. Another little side comment, and that is there seems to be a glycogen window. Now, how much and how important we should make this, who knows? But it's big in athletic circles. And I don't think there's any harm to it. It's just saying it isn't necessarily like the only way to do this. But it makes sense and it's worth learning about. I'm just saying don't start a fight over it. So during the first 2 hours after exercise, sugar is more readily absorbed into the body. And what they think is happening here is you have GLUT2, GLUT4 receptors also with insulin that will just take in this sugar. But then after that, after exercise, those disappear and you're not as efficient getting sugar out of the bloodstream. And so if during this you finish exercise, in this first 2 hours, you have heightened carbohydrate absorption. And then by 4 hours later, it returns to normal. So what that means is if you're going to do repeated bouts of exercise, so you have a tournament and you play multiple days in a row, even if it's a Friday, Saturday, and you go out and you work really hard on Friday, and then you're going to have to do the same thing on Saturday. The team that replenished carbohydrates right after the game will physiologically have an advantage on Saturday. And if you didn't, I'm just too tired. I want to sit in the sauna. I want to, something like that. And you don't replenish and you do it 4 hours after or not at all, you're not going to have the energy of the people that fed themselves immediately. And in fact, it seems like within the first 30 minutes post-exercise is the highest of carbohydrate absorption. So this is the first research, and this is Gatorade doing good research. It's not just money making stuff. They have a really good lab where they do this kind of stuff. So they did this. Then the same thing happened. They did it with protein, and they said, when should we replenish protein? And so they had people in the weight room. They had protein before, they have it during, they have it after, and it ends up you need to have protein available for those muscles to be rebuilt and stuff. And then they tried combinations. And the best combination was to have your carbohydrate and your protein together, and you would be replenished and you'd be building muscle. And you've probably heard this about the chocolate milk. The chocolate milk makes a good one because it has carbohydrates, it has some protein, it has some fats in it, and it's a great recovery. Now, whether or not you need chocolate milk, like for me, I never work hard enough to deserve chocolate milk. It's just added sugar. There's nothing nutritional about it. It's just more sugar. So if you're a big time athlete that really did it, you can earn that, and then that counts as your calories. For me, I don't need that many more carbs in the sugar form. I would rather get my carbs in some other way. But that's the idea, and I'm sure that a lot of you have heard about that. So a little bit of sports physiology, exercise physiology, is the idea that if you have, especially a couple hours before, when should this pre-game meal be eaten? And so a lot of people are up to 4 hours, 3 hours, 2 hours beforehand, but probably 3 or 4 is what most people think. So that things are out of your gut, but people get used to anything. And when you're 18 to 22, you can live on a lot of things. But as you get older, maybe some foods, or some of you just have more sensitive intestinal issues, you learn to know how nervous you are and what foods sit well. But basically, what they want is low glycemic foods, like a burrito or something like that. For me, I like a Swedish pancake, and it's like other pancakes, except that it's almost like a crepe, only there's more substance to it. It's less fat, but it's high in protein and carbs. So, for instance, my recipe that I do for groups, it's like 6 eggs to 1 cup of flour, and so it's a lot of protein, and then 3 cups of milk with that as well. And so to me, that's a great pregame because it gives me enough carb, it gives me protein there when I'm breaking down the muscle, and all that kind of stuff. But it sits well on my stomach and that kind of thing. Some people, like for me, the one food I can't have before I exercise is at least in any kind of quantity, is orange juice. I just it does not sit well with me. So you'll figure that out for you. So we've already learned that some of the hormones that are released during exercise uh, can inhibit insulin. So if you wanted to have some sugar, you could have it during exercise. My teammate used to have honey right before he went out. I don't think that we worked hard enough or long enough for him to deplete his body of the glucose and glycogen already in there. But some of these people that do marathons or those kinds of things, they may want something like that. After 2 hours of exercise is when you start depleting, well, or you get depleted of that. But with stop start, high intensity type things, an hour and a half, you're probably not going to deplete your body. And so here, this idea of over 2 hours, you also have to worry about hydration, and they make special things for this with fructose and then these polymers, and so they're more complicated. It's going to take longer to break them down. So now I'm getting back to these high protein, low carb diets. And so how are we going to be able to exercise and do all this kind of stuff on these? But there's critics of high protein diets. And the reason is if you're having a lot of protein, a lot of times you don't have enough fiber. And then the other is that package. Are you doing too much of fat and of the saturated type fat and animal fat and those kinds of things? And so they think that would be bad for your health. The other is that cancer and heart disease both benefit from having high fiber. So again, fruits and vegetables, and these high protein diets aren't known for being big on fruits and vegetables because they have carbs in them. And the most serious consequence of high protein diets is the rise in fat consumption, which has long been associated with cardiovascular disease. Willet refers to the package the protein comes in. Animal protein tends to come with saturated fat. Not all the protein books are alike. Their programs vary. Atkins is one of the most permissive. Atkins, I cannot say enough negative things about his new diet revolution and what he did to people by promoting this. But the idea was he's very restrictive on carbs and fine with any kind of fat you want. So here's an illustration of a snack that is in his book, and it's called the Swiss snack. It consists of wrapping bacon strips around cubes of Swiss cheese and deep frying them in hot oil. The recipe, which serves one, calls for 4 strips of bacon and a quarter-pound of cheese. Now, this is going to make somebody be very satiated. This is going to take a long time to digest. They're probably going to like the flavors and this kind of thing. People can lose weight on this. They've done it. But is it good for your heart? Is it good for your health? That's the big deal. These are some examples of people that have been on Atkins' diet and they're true believers. So here this lady, and I'm going to tell you that later on we find out she's works for the government. She's an executive. She's educated. But she lost 15 pounds in 2 months on the Atkins diet while loading up on steak with béarnaise sauce and broccoli with hollandaise dripping all of it. So those sauces are very fatty, buttery sauces. But she also lost something else, the ability to have a normal bowel movement, because she stayed on the induction phase of the diet, a 2-week segment that prohibits all fruit, all whole grains, and many vegetables. She was ingesting very little fiber. So she built a concrete block in her intestines because of all of this. And so that's not heart healthy, that's not anything healthy. But could she lose weight? Yes, she lost weight. So here, she had to go in and have a medical procedure to unblock her bowel, and then she started on the diet again. She had to abandon it once again because she became constipated. But it broke my heart. I'm a believer. She found something that she could do, and she enjoyed doing it. She liked the food, but she wasn't considering that it's more than just losing weight. That it's also about their health. Here's another one. Ruben, he said, I great fried eggs and omelets. He was delighted we could have pastrami, which is a really fatty meat, and corned beef till the cows come home, but not on a sandwich. He couldn't have the bread. He says his blood cholesterol level is unchanged at 220. Now, we want it to be under 200, but 220. So his doctor told him he was fine, although he wouldn't offer any endorsement. He said, go ahead and do what you're going to do anyway. But all the weight came back. This is a different one. I'm sorry. This is Sugar Buster. So this is another one where no sugar, but you can have nuts, cheese, all this kind of stuff, but you can't have any refined grains. And then they started to cheat on the diet. So now, besides having all the sugar, they're having the sugar back that they used to have, plus all the calories in nuts and cheese. And so they easily regain the fat. You can't cheat on these. So now, why do you lose weight on these high protein diets? Now, some of it over time, you can lose fat, okay? Because you're satiated. You feel full when you eat protein and fat. You can go longer in between. It's not like rice cakes or something like that you digest them quickly and you're hungry again. When we restrict energy intake too much too soon in order to lose weight, quickly, the body is forced to use up stores of carbohydrate and break down protein in the muscle. So we don't want that to happen. And so some of these people, it's not going to be healthy. As both carbohydrate and protein hold water in the cells, a loss of these macronutrients also results in net loss of water. As a result, rapid weight loss often can be made up of 75% water loss. So when they say lose 10 pounds in a week, hopefully that's water, because if it's not, it means you're losing muscle too. But it's not going to be fat in that quantity and that fast. So after the energy system stabilized, water is regained because some of the protein and carbs that were initially lost are replenished. The water is drawn back into the cell, thus gaining back a little weight. This is the big deal on that. If you're talking about high protein, low carbohydrate diets, you need to remember that every gram of glycogen stores 3 grams of water with it, 3 to 4 grams. So to illustrate this point in a way that you won't forget, here we have Rich Gaspari, and he was known as the Dragon Slayer bodybuilder, obviously. And he's supposedly the first bodybuilder to demonstrate striated gluteal muscles. Now, first off, I don't know if any of these guys use steroids or whatever, but I'm going to show you some other pictures, and I'm sure they use steroids. But your glutes are your last reservoir of body fat. Everybody, we talk about hormones and how we lose it, where our genetics tell us we should lose it, whether it's our pot belly or our thighs or our face or whatever. But all of us keep fat on our glutes. And so he is unbelievably lean, okay? But also, he is dehydrated. So 10 days, 2 weeks before, he quits eating carbs. And as he loses the carbs, he loses the water that is with the carbs, and so he gets unbelievably ripped. So here, as we look at his close-up of his glutes, by eliminating carbs before competition, competitors also get rid of water stored with the carbs, giving them a more ripped appearance. When they eat carbs and drink water again, they will appear smoother and less cut. And so this can happen within hours afterwards. And some of them eat sugar right before, but then they don't drink. And so anyway, and that, it's interesting, is for vascularization. Isn't that interesting? I know we all want to look like that. And I know I want you to remember, this is an illustration of no carbs in the body. Okay, this is probably an illustration of steroid use. So this lecture is my attempt to give you enough background to know what to look for and question as we examine popular diets more closely. So you had to understand how the insulin response thing works and why low carb, high protein, all of that. How our diets can stimulate different hormones. And so if we have carbs, and now I'm saying all carbs, and that's an overstatement, but let's really get to the extreme here and say simple carbs. As you have more of them in your body, then that's going to increase insulin. That's going to increase fat storage. So one of the worst scenarios that could possibly be is to drink a soft drink on an empty stomach, because your blood sugar is going to go up and you're going to store a lot of those calories as fat. A high protein diet, thus low carb, would work to avoid this situation. And that's why these diets are based on this. You eliminate carbs, you eliminate the insulin response. This is also true of intermittent fasting. So you don't have carbs for a certain amount of hours, then later you have carbs in a certain period. But by lowering the carbohydrate intake, you lower the insulin response, you lower fat storage, and with the intermittent fasting, then you burn fat. So there's some other things that as we're moving forward, and this is this week's whole lecture, and I'll get out this other stuff to you that you can work at your own pace and those kinds of things. But for now, I'm setting you up, and I'll tell you which documentaries we're going to look at. But what's going to happen is I want you to look at the vegetarian ones first, and the vegan ones. I'm sorry, but they'll slip in and out of some verbiage that it's really irritating to me because I want to know the facts here. And so here, sometimes they'll say plant-based. Okay, who's not for eating more plants? Even if you don't like them, I'm sure everybody understands plants are good for you. It's the basis of life for us. And so here, what some dictionaries say plant-based is, it's a derived diet consisting mostly of entirely of foods derived from plants, including vegetables, grains, nuts, seeds, legumes, fruits, with few or no animal products. Okay, a plant-based diet is not necessarily vegetarian. So this gets back to my original question there with the idea of, are vegetarians healthy because they avoid meat or because they eat so many plants? So what if a meat eater ate that many plants? Would they be just as healthy? Okay, a vegetarian or vegetarianism is the practice of abstaining from consumption of animals, but may include animal products such as milk and eggs. So this would be an ovo-vegetarian or a lacto-vegetarian. Now, the reason is this makes it easy to get protein, and it avoids the idea of killing an animal. So for many people that it's a spiritual thing is to take a life. This doesn't necessarily take a life. And so they might be okay with it. A pescatarian is someone that eats fish. Why we look at fish differently than we do birds, and why we look at birds differently than look at cows. And so somehow we treasure mammals above insects. And so that's for some of you guys to work out. And then a vegan diet. So a strict vegan, they're made up of only plant-based foods. This type of diet includes fruits, vegetables, soy, legumes, nuts, nut butters, plant-based excuse me, dietary alternatives, sprouted, fermented plant foods, and whole grains. Vegans don't include animal foods like eggs, dairy, meat, poultry, or seafood. Okay? So when we look at these, some of these people will say vegan and they'll tell a story, but then they'll slip in things like this plant-based diet, and then you go, wait, does that mean you give some animal products or something like that? So that's part of where I'm nervous, and I want you to be aware of where we're headed with this. But we're going to look at Overcomers. It's a documentary on Netflix. I'll get you directions to that. And I mentioned before, there's some words on there I'd like to bleep out, especially Arnold Schwarzenegger has a few. But it was so popular. And then, and so that'll take up all of next week is looking at that. It's 2 hours worth, but you're going to take notes. And then we're going to look at the rebuttals. And by then, you're going to really understand the ins and outs of this. So this is my first attempt at online. I hope you're surviving all of this. And I'll include other ways to reach me if you're having problems. Continue with your chapters in your textbook, and We'll get through this.